right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Sex Sales Podcast, the podcast where we talk about culture, behavior, society, relationships from a male and a female perspective. Today we're talking about fetishes and how they may impact a relationship or with a significant other, but also a relationship with a family, with a community. So we're going to delve into that. I'm sure that will be juicy, both literally and figuratively. We're going to start on that at the 3-minute mark. Before we get to that, we've got a few announcements. Comedy Untamed, as I'm sure you know, these are the series of stand-up shows that I help manage across the east coast of Australia. That Brisbane show will definitely be on sale by the time this goes out. That will be a one-off opening night show. I'll be there on that one. That's July 6th, I believe. All the details are on the website. So go to comedyuntamed.com. There's a big mega showcase happening at the end of the year, which will also be where I film my next stand-up special. We're flying in the best acts from, the best act from the Brisbane show, the best act from the Melbourne show, and then a wild card. And then you guys get to decide. So if you live in Sydney or the Sydney area, I recommend you come to that. It's going to be huge. It's going to be changing the game of Australian comedy. So comedyuntamed.com. And of course, regular shows happening Sydney, Melbourne, Newcastle, and soon to be Brisbane. So come see a show. I've got a solo tour that I'll be announcing soon that will be happening in October, November this year. I'll be going to all the capital cities in Australia, plus a few other, minor cities, your Canberras, your Gold Coasts, your Newcastles, etc. So neilcolehatka.com for that. Stay tuned. That will be announced in the coming weeks. We're sponsored by Crush Organics. Crush have a giant range of CBD oils and CBD oil products. They've got pain cream. They've got just your regular CBD oil. They've got CBD oil for your pets. They've got the gummies. The gummies are great. I'll often have one or two before bed, and I sleep like a baby. Maybe Eliza should get Remy on the CBD gummies.
Just thinking that.
Help him sleep. So get yourself some CBD oil products from Crush Organics. That's Crush with a K. Go to crushorganics.com. Use the code NEIL and you get 40% off. It also helps support the podcast if you go and get some. So crushorganics.com. Use the code NEIL, N-E-E-L, not N-E-I-L. Be surprised how many people still don't know how to spell my name. So N-E-E-L, the logical way to spell Neil. All right, fetishes. Let's get into it. Okay, so we've broadly spoken about fetishes and sexual proclivities previously on this podcast, but what did you want to explore specifically about fetishes on this one?
Well, this kind of stems off from the waifuism one because I came across the waifu subreddit based on a post that was made in the relationship subreddit where it was actually someone saying, my partner is obsessed with this fictional character and she is prioritizing that above my relationship. And then I kind of got thinking, how does fetish or kink or different styles of love and intimacy affect your relationships with who you're in romantically with, or even like your family or the broader community. And just like a very small niche example is I used to work with a client who was part of the furry community, and she, the furry community isn't necessarily always sexual or kink or fetish type. And by the way, I should define that fetish is defined as an attraction to a non-living object or body part that isn't genitals. And so she's part of the furry community, and she would say like, oh, it's not all sexual, but she did engage in the sexual side of it, as many people do in those communities. And so when we would meet in public for coffee shops or client meetings and things like that, she would wear the furry tail, the ear. She wouldn't wear a full fursuit, but she would make little hints towards it. And she'd always say, and we could observe that she'd be getting looks from the public and dirty looks, and she was really young, like 18. But I thought it was really interesting, like how when people are aware of it, is it inappropriate to then subject people, or even in a more extreme level, people that are into pet play? Like I've been seeing videos on TikTok of people pretending to be a dog or a cat for sexual reasons, and they're being walked on a lead around public. So is that ethical and appropriate to subject the community to that? Or even children, when their parents are engaged in swinging, non monogamy, or other kinds of fetish that is around the house, for example. What's right and what's
Around
wrong
the
with
house.
that?
Here's
Yeah,
my
well,
dom outfit,
yeah,
and my
or like
5-year-old can
sex
see.
swings and
Right.
rooms. You never know. It's
Yeah.
hard to hide at times, and especially when it's I think for me the most interesting dynamic is like a dom sub dynamic, where there's one person is dominant and one person is submissive, and this kind of falls under the BDSM umbrella, and how that comes out often when people are really into BDSM. That's not just something they do in the bedroom, it's something that they may live in their relationship. So I've seen, and even as someone that has studied sexology and relationship counseling, I do struggle with this a little bit. I can understand it in the bedroom, but then when there is, and it's usually a man as the master, and it could be a master slave dynamic, or a man as a dom, and then seeing him be demanding and belittling or telling someone what to do as part of just their relationship dynamic, and then putting it down to actually we're in a dom sub relationship dynamic. I can understand it and I can appreciate it, and I don't think that there's actually much that's wrong with that consent, considering that you're both consenting, if so. But it is an interesting dynamic to see, like, well, this kind of can rub people the wrong way, to see that that might be considered sexist. It could be considered abusive to outside people. So yeah, that was me rambling in a nutshell what I wanted to get into, but
It's
there's
an
a lot there.
important, yeah, you're right,
Yeah.
because it's a very important question that society right now needs to answer, or at least try to answer. And my initial thoughts would be that it's all very contextual. It depends on the fetish, depends how that's displayed. My general sentiment would be whatever you want to do in the privacy of your homes, or in
Yeah.
the clubs that you may visit, assuming of course it's all consensual. Go for it. Do whatever you want if you're an adult and it's consensual. You're correct in saying the ethical conundrum arises when that might be displayed in a public setting or in a community setting, and that's something that I also am I'm uneasy about. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. So that example that you just said there, where there's a man who's the dom and a woman who's the sub. Now, if that was in the privacy of their own house or at a particular club, go for it. Do whatever you want. When you see that in public, that's it's confronting. And then we also, as a society, are talking about how young boys might be subsumed into certain toxically masculine cultures if they observe that, and that could be what is occurring as a byproduct, as a consequence of some of that behavior. At the same time, I suppose if they're both consenting adults and they're in a bar or something like that, we're not even talking about, say, an environment where children are around, you could easily argue what's the issue. Similarly with the furry situation, I I don't know. I'm in two minds about that sort of thing as well. There's nothing really inherently wrong with people
Yeah.
walking around in the big furry costumes. When it does get sexual, from their perspective, why are you shaming something that gives us a lot of pleasure and enjoyment? From other people's perspective, it's just very different, and it's it can be confronting, and it's just maybe a bit weird as well to a lot of people. There does seem to be this emphasis on normalizing anything and everything that could
Yeah.
constitute a sexual proclivity. And well, I have two thoughts on that. My first thought is when you normalize a lot of these sort of inappropriate, well, what many people would consider inappropriate kinks or sexual proclivities, that may actually make it less appealing for other people, because humans, by our nature, are often drawn to things that we see as naughty and mischievous and
Taboo.
inappropriate and taboo. And so when you normalize all these kind of behaviors, then you're taking the taboo away from it, and it may actually lose its excitement. I don't know if anyone's been in a situation like that, but I'd be interested to hear about it if they have. And simultaneously, I read this book a few years ago, Your Brain on Sex. It's on one of my Instagram story highlights, and it's a really fascinating book about how many people's early impactful formative experiences can manifest as what people could consider radical sexual proclivities or behaviors in their adult life. And so many of these could be a symptom of something that might need, an unhealed childhood wound or something like that. Now, I know it's also a precarious conversation to have, because people can get very defensive about that. People will say, "Oh, why do you always assume that what I enjoy doing has to be some sort of psychological deficiency?" It may not be, but it also could be. And if it's not sort of drastically impacting your life in a negative way, and like I said, if everyone's consenting, go for it. I do lean towards just having a basic level of civil decorum that's expected of people in a public context, especially if children are around. However, what that code of behavior is up in the air, and I don't have an exact answer. I personally wouldn't. I don't know. It's not the end of the world. I don't think it's sinful or extraordinarily shameful or anything like that. But I just think there are certain things that would just benefit from being left in the privacy of people's homes, or in clubs or bars or specific areas where that community can express themselves.
Yeah, I think that it's an interesting point when people talk about, and I've definitely fallen into this track as well, thinking about where did this come from when someone discloses a fetish or a kink that they have, and immediately trying to draw it back to, was it a childhood thing? Where did this stem from? But it is a known thing, and it is a studied research fact that our sexual preferences can often, not always, but often do become imprinted during our early childhood experiences. And I was actually talking about this today where Adrian had his friends over, and Remy, and I'm not saying that my 8-month-old baby has a fetish or kink or will, but he's obsessed with feet, like obsessed with feet at the moment. And he's obsessed with shoes. He's obsessed with trying to suck on toes. It's weird. He's literally obsessed with feet. And I was telling them that one theory for foot fetish is actually one of the most common fetishes that exists. And I was saying that one theory is that when kids, because they're on their crawling stage, like Remy is now, when they're on the ground so often, the first thing they see when they see their primary caregiver come towards them is their feet. And then that coincides with feelings of love and comfort and nurture. So that could be something that imprints on them later in life. And it's even been studied in animals that goats that were raised by sheep will actually have sexual preferences for sheeps once they reach their sexual development, which is really interesting. Even though it makes no sense evolutionarily or biologically, they are sexually inclined towards sheep if they were raised by sheep. So super, super interesting. And another one I learned was that older siblings are more likely to have a pregnancy fetish because they saw their mother being pregnant with their sibling.
Oh my
and
God.
It's no way do they find sexual arousal at that time or any kind of attraction to their mother. It's something that develops later on in life, just like it can be leather from car seats. And one interesting fact I learned, this is probably my favorite, was that back when we were growing up as kids and teenagers, in any kind of like action movies, quicksand was like a really big thing in movies. And it developed into a fetish for a lot of people. However, it is no longer a common fetish because it's no longer in movies. So when people would see that around the age or something of their sexual development and be something that was really exciting to them, like, oh, quicksand, it's not something that's turning them on. It's something that develops later on. So it is really interesting. And BDSM, there's a lot of talk about whether that developed from trauma or if that's just someone wanting to give up control. I read this book. It's one of my favorite books. It's called In the Garden of Desire. And it's, oh God, it's so old, this book.
Did read that one. I read some of that one.
Yeah, and it talks about like women's top 5 erotic fantasies, and a lot of it was about being submissive, and most of the women that wanted to be submissive were like the CEOs or people that were really like tightly wound and couldn't relax and run the household. They just dreamt of being swept off their feet by someone who would take control, as well as vampire, werewolves. That was a whole other category and things like that.
It's probably fair to assume that there'll then be more instances of that as more women are moving into positions of power and what would be considered more traditionally masculine roles. There will likely be an abundance of this sort of yearning for, masculine sexual dominance.
Yeah, that's so true. Very true. That's a good point, actually. I wonder if it will become more popularized. And I know that a lot of people talk a lot more openly about what kinks and fetish they have and are quite upfront about it. God, I've had so many people when I was on my Tinder days tell me what their kinks were, and some of them were just so out there. I actually had people tell me about pregnancy kink a few times in my early 20s, which at that point I was like, wow, this is fascinating, absolutely fascinating to me. But I guess to link it back to relationships, I did see someone post online the other day saying that she's in a BDSM relationship with her partner and they have a safe word. He's the dom, she's the sub, and he was, I won't go into the details, but basically she was saying no and she was saying the safe word and he didn't stop. And the agreement is that there is a safe word, and she was saying afterwards, like, that's our safe word, that immediately means stop. We agreed on that, this is my consent, etc. And he said, well, I'm the dom, I get to do what I want, I get to disregard it. So I think that even though it's just sexual fun, there is so much that needs to be talked about and communicated prior. And I guess this is what I was thinking about when I was thinking about the impact that it has on relationships, is that in some kinks and fetishes like BDSM, you almost do have to be an expert. You need to know about consent, you need to know about safe words, you need to know about aftercare, and all of these things that people are just like, oh, I just want to hurt someone or be hurt, and think it's as simple as that. And then the other thing I see pop up more and more frequently is what do you do when your partner is into something very unique that you're not willing to engage in? And further from that, there is a subreddit called Ask Reddit After Dark. I live on this. It's so good. And one of the questions was like, what fetish do you have that your partner doesn't know about? And there was like thousands and thousands of people saying that they have this fetish for 18 years, like cuckolding fetish, or even things that are more unique, and their partner has no idea. And so then it comes into, well, do you be very upfront about it and tell them from the get-go, but when you start dating, or do you introduce it when you're already in love? And how do you have these conversations? And a lot of people were embarrassed by them. Obviously, there's some that no, like, if I ever said this, they would say no. And I actually saw another girl say that her partner recently said he's always really wanted to be like experiment with open relationships and swinging, and they'd been together for 4 years and he'd never mentioned it, and he was the love of her life, or is the love of her life. And then as soon as he said it, she's like, I can't be with him. Like, now that I know that that's what he wants and what he desires, I just don't want to be with him anymore. So there's that risk, which is why I think it's almost better to be upfront about it, but then it's hard when it's something that might be considered a bit more on the not your average side.
Yeah, I would probably, if you're in that situation, talk to friends
Oh,
first and see
but
what
what
they
if
think.
you have a foot fetish and you tell your friends that can you
Oh,
trust them
true.
to truly be
That's a good point. Yeah.
neutral?
Well,
You
I just
know,
think before you talk to your partner, maybe just if you can get some sort of external opinion about how, out of the bounds of normality your
yeah,
fetish may be, a therapist or someone yeah, Reddit even, just an online forum,
yeah,
before you talk to your partner about it. And then I think
yeah,
there's a responsibility on the partner to listen with some degree of an open mind. I guess if there is a situation like what you just mentioned, where someone just it causes that person to just not see that person the same way, it's very hard to come back from that sometimes.
yeah, yeah,
I mean, there was a situation in one of my earlier relationships where, yeah, a similar sort of thing happened, and then I got very defensive and sort of insecure about it because she had
yeah,
expressed a similar sort of fetish,
yeah,
and then I expressed one that, was just almost the inverse of that, if you will.
yeah.
I don't know. I know people probably want to know the details. I don't feel comfortable talking about the details of it,
It's
but
okay.
um,
Yeah.
then she got quite upset and said she doesn't know if she can be with someone like that.
Oh,
And I got angry. I was like, well, you said this thing
yeah,
that's basically the same thing. And then I'm saying, and I, was supportive of that. You can be supportive with it while still having a boundary and saying, oh, I don't want to
yeah,
do it. But
yeah,
that's cool if that's what you're into. I can't fulfill that, unfortunately, if it's a deal breaker for the relationship.
yeah,
Maybe you do need to be with someone else.
yeah,
But I think people might have to, yeah, just be conscious of their reactions in that situation because, yeah, the partner could be holding on to something that means a lot to them and wants someone to just support them, not necessarily validate whatever that proclivity or yearning may be, but just to not react as though they're a strange or
yeah,
morally deficient person. I mean, depending on the fetish, if someone comes out and says, I want to sleep with a kid or something, well then yeah, you can react that way. But
yes,
talking about things that aren't illegal here,
yeah,
um, it's very contextual, isn't it?
yeah. I mean,
It's all dependent on the relationship, on the
yeah.
fetish, how they want to do it, whether they want to do it all the time or once. So many questions.
Yeah, I think that's good advice that you started with. Like, find maybe not necessarily your friends, but find a sounding board and forums online. There is a subreddit for literally everything. I found a subreddit for people that want to recreate, like I don't know what the actual fetish is called. I can't remember, but recreating the birthing experience, and they create giant 1 by 1 meter tall vaginas, and out of like they just out of everything they find materials, they source things, and then they recreate being birthed. They have the liquids, they have the blood. It's just so fascinating. There's a subreddit for people that have sneezing fetishes, and they're like, oh, does a bigger nose mean more sneeze, and all these like unique questions. It's just like anything you're into, you can find your people, in the same way that we talked about waifuism the other day. It's such a supportive community, and I go through like these crazy rabbit holes just because of morbid curiosity, more than, well, yeah, that's literally the only reason. I'm always curious. I'm always trying to learn about it. I'm always trying to understand it. But it is really hard when you're trying to introduce that to someone and you're not sure if they're going to have an open mind about it. And I had an experience of, I've had a lot of experience of people being upfront with me about it, about fetish or whatever. And I like that it's upfront because I'm like, okay, I can tell straight off the bat if this is going to be something that we're compatible with or not, or if this is going to be something that I have to put a boundary in, or I'm not down for, or whatever. And like I was talking to this one guy once years ago, and he was really into like a cuckolding fetish, and I wasn't even. I was just like, cool, like whatever, that's fine. I've talked to you for like a week. That's no opinion on it, whether I was for or against it. Nothing didn't worry me in the slightest. But it dominated our entire conversation where every time he'd be like, what are you doing? And I'd be like, I'm going out tonight. He'd be like, are you going to sleep with another guy? Are you going to be doing this? I bet you're going to the bar to do this. And I was like, oh, again, like every single conversation. What are you doing?
So-
I'm on my way to work. Who
Was
do you
he was
work
he
with?
wanting to engage in a kind of psychological fantasy of he didn't necessarily want you to sleep with someone that night, but the idea of you doing that was
Oh, he did want me to sleep
titillating?
with someone that
Okay.
night, and
Right.
and then he was like, "I'll take you to Bali, and like we'll go out to bars." And I was like, "I haven't even met you." Like,
There's a lot of men who are into cuckolding. Do you know of any women who are into cuckolding?
not person. I know of women, but not. I don't know personally within my groups, but I do see like it does exist.
Girlfriend or wife was like, "Who are you going to sleep with tonight? I want to watch." Like,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. I do see. I come
Be
across it a
interesting.
little bit here and there. It's not as common because I think that anything that falls under the realm of that could be linked to like humiliation
Yeah.
comes much more commonly with men, which is interesting. But yeah, there's definitely women that engage in it. And if you like, you might be getting the best of both worlds there, or sometimes people do cuckolding both ways. So it's super, super interesting. But yeah, I think that I think I talked about this years ago, but when I was like pretty active in the vegan social community where people would catch up and meet up, every single person, even as friends or if they were interested in sleeping with each other, but even just as friends, would share their like BDSM test quiz results. So if you just Google BDSM test, there's a test you can do, and it has like all these variations of, are you a dom, are you a sub, are you a brat, are you vanilla, are you into like, are you a masochist, you into age play, pet play, every single kink basically. And people would just share this and then be like, oh, you're 75% this, so am I. Or like, well, we're the opposite, or we match really well. So it was really
Wow.
funny how that was, I don't know why that just was linked into the
It's
veganism, but
very,
everyone was so open and shared them constantly.
it's a very
And
sort
I
of
like that people were just upfront about it. I thought it cut so much time.
very rational way of deciding who should sleep with who, isn't it? Doing a quiz and, oh, all right, you'll do.
Statistically, this makes no sense.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Isn't that
I think it's
interesting?
a lot of lack of judgment, except to meat eaters. There was a lot of judgment to that, but to anyone else, there was no judgment. Anything you could say or do would go, which was funny. So maybe in some ways it is better to be forward and upfront about it, especially if I think it's really important to acknowledge or understand how much of this are you going to want in your relationship. Like, is this a necessity for you, or is it a secret thing that you want to keep to yourself? And can you reach sexual satisfaction and happiness without engaging in that? If so, if you can't, then you need to tell your partner, like, I need engagement with this. And if you can't or you're not willing, that's totally fair, but it's an incompatibility. So I think that that's an important thing to distinguish.
I think people also tend to forget there's nothing inherently wrong with keeping something to yourself. You don't
Yeah.
necessarily have to share every
Yep.
single thought or proclivity you may have. I know there's probably a lot of men who want to have a fivesome or something like that, but you can't expect a partner to engage in something like that, especially when you have other goals for your relationship, such as
Yeah.
pair bonding or building a family or building a life together.
Yep.
There are certain things that should maybe just stay in the realm of fantasy because
Yeah.
your imagination is probably more powerful than real life.
Yep.
And our psychological arousal can be very powerful. That's another good reason to wean yourself off porn, because then it just increases the power of your imagination. And
Yeah.
forget about the privacy of your own home. You've got the privacy of your own mind. That's your little sanctuary where you can do whatever you want to do, essentially, and still feel relative. If you're really immersed in that fantasy, you can almost feel like you're really there. You can have those same sensations and almost trick your brain into thinking that you actually were there. It's like very deep meditation and sort of story through that meditation. You can have a similar experience with a
Tantric.
sexual fantasy. Yeah. So I don't think that everything has to be
Yeah.
out in the open publicly and normalized. And I think it's good to talk about these things and explore them. But in certain contexts, I do think it's inappropriate, especially when kids are around or if it's just a general community setting. I think there can be some, doesn't necessarily have to be legislated over where there are laws, but if there's a community where, say, there's one person in the community of 100 or, maybe a handful, like three or four that do engage in sexual behaviors that many others would take umbrage towards, and they're displaying that in a public setting, and a few other members of the community say, hey, that's not appropriate, we don't really want to see that. And then they can often take it upon themselves to get defensive and say, well, why are you shaming our behaviors? But at the
Yeah.
same time, on the other end of the, they're not necessarily respecting the consent of these other community members, because as a community, they may not consent to wanting to see that. In the same
Yeah.
way, in a
Yeah.
one-on-one setting, someone may not consent to wanting to engage in a significant dom sub relationship or a furry relationship, whatever it may be. There's also, I suppose, a community-based consent where people may say, look, do it in the privacy of your own home, and you should have every right to do that in the privacy of your own home or in an organization of some sort where everyone knows what they're getting into. But when it's broadcast on maybe mainstream television or just sort of unregulated on the internet, then there are other members of the community or the nation even who may be saying, look, we don't, I would argue it actually does come down to a form of consent. Like I don't want to see this. I don't want to have to engage with it. I don't want to impose any restrictions on these people to be able to do that in the privacy of their own homes. But I should not have to, validate and necessarily normalize
Yeah.
every single sexual proclivity
Yeah.
out there.
Yeah, it's such a good point. When I was like 19, I worked at Westfield Warringah Mall as like concierge, and I had this mum come up to me. We had like these huge like 20 meter by 10 meter advertising for like lingerie that was hanging from the ceiling, and this mum came up and she was embarrassing her poor teenage boy. It was so, I felt so bad for him, but basically she was saying like, we don't want to see this, we don't consent to seeing women naked, essentially. Like, they were wearing lingerie, they weren't naked, but she was like, we don't consent to this, so why are you forcing it in our face and making my teenage boy uncomfortable? He's going through puberty. And I was like, oh, this poor kid. But it is an interesting point, and even keeping it in your home, I've seen people talk about, well, my roommates engage in like this fetish or in BDSM, and then I have to hear her being beat or slapped, or him even, and I don't want to be around that or subjected to that. And when think about like more obscure fetish or people that are into like balloons or Velcro or scratchy surfaces or certain things, or God, how many times have I seen someone fucking jacking off in public, creepy men looking at women, just, it is,
Yeah.
it becomes almost assault. It's not even about consent. It's, if someone has not consented, it is an assault. And I remember when I worked at Lifeline, a suicide phone hotline, we would get callers in. I can't remember the name. It starts with K, but it's a fetish where they get off making inappropriate phone calls, and I'd get callers in who would be getting off on the phone, but legally I wasn't allowed to hang
Jesus
up on them
Christ.
because it's a suicide hotline. So I remember
I've
one
heard
guy.
that from a few people who've worked at Lifeline. It's quite
Yeah,
common.
and it happens to people that work at Domino's, but they can hang up. But that's what they call hotlines, because they're not allowed to hang up. So I was talking through one guy, and he asked me to do a guided meditation.
Oh, that's
And
right. Yeah.
yeah,
Oh
and
God.
I was going to do this whole thing, and I could just hear it happening. And then I was saying, "Hi, look, this is getting inappropriate. I'm starting to understand what's going on here. I'm going to hang up. This is your first warning. I'll be hanging up." And he was like, "No, no, don't stop." And then I was like, "No, I'm sorry, I'm leaving the phone." And he was like, "No, keep talking." And I was like, "I'm leaving that." And then I heard it heard him complete, and I just, for fuck's sake, I did do a university assignment on that, so some good came out of it. But yeah, I didn't realize it for a few years, but that like it didn't have an impact on me. I rolled my eyes and laughed about it that night, but that is an assault, and it's scary what people can be into and are getting off to in the public. So, and even public sex, for example, is huge and people are so into it. And how many times do people like, oh, I saw these people doing this in the bush or whatever. And it's kind of funny, but it's also like, it's also not. And how can people engage in those things and keep it private? And I definitely agree with what you said as well about certain things. You don't have to disclose every fetish to all your partners or every kink. And certain things that if you want to keep private, it's completely fine to keep private. I don't believe that your partner has to know every single thing about you. And I did see the other day someone saying like, what was the most recent not safe for work thought you had? And there were so many comments, or who did you last fantasize about, or something like that. So many people were saying my wife's sister, my wife's best friend, my coworker, even though I'm married. And I was like, for fuck's sake, I would never, ever want to know that about my husband or my boyfriend. Like, I'm not going to deny that those thoughts would happen, but I would never want to know it. I would never have it acknowledged to me. Like, keep that shit to yourself. Imagine knowing your husband to your sister. Oh, God, after reading that subreddit, I was so glad afterwards I don't have a sister, because there was like thousands of people saying it. I couldn't believe, like, is everyone's wife's sister, are they all just really attractive, or is it just the fact that it's the sister? I don't know. It was baffling.
Yeah, it's probably a likeness and the fact that it's inappropriate and taboo.
So interesting. But I was like, that's things you should take to the grave.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I don't understand people who need to always evangelize about every fantasy and proclivity they've had. There's things I definitely wouldn't talk about on a public forum, and I've talked about all sorts of things on this podcast and the other one, and there's just a wealth of information I will never let leave my mind. But at the same time, I don't think there's there may be this may be a consequence of people using their sexual preferences and proclivities or fetishes as a major facet of their identity when it need not be as significant as you have made it. So everyone should be entitled to their preferences and whatever they want to do in the privacy of their home. But if you make that the entirety or the bulk of your identity or personality, then of course you'd want people to validate that, because that's you, that's how you see yourself. And when, say, it's a part of who you are, hey, look, in the privacy of my own home, I like to do this, I like to do X, Y, Z, but I don't need to tell everyone, I don't expect everyone to validate that and call it normal, then that's a healthier way, seemingly, to go about this. However, there's probably some kind of, could be trauma, just experiences that people have had that cause these preferences or proclivities to be such a major part of their identity.
Or to feel the urge to overshare can also be a trauma response. Yeah.
Definitely, yeah.
Exactly. And it's, God, does it happen? It's like, and it is an interesting point you make that people do. It is very accepted now to talk about, which I love. Personally, I love that. But does it get taken too far when you're sitting and someone just says, oh, by the way, I'm getting off to this very frequently, whereas someone who doesn't have a fetish or a kink is unlikely to say, hey, I'm getting off to lesbian porn tonight or whatever. Where if they're not engaged in a fetish kink, they're less likely to share their sexual proclivities and interests. So that is an interesting aspect. But I guess if you're in a situation where you feel like where you're with a partner or your partner has a kink or fetish that you're not that into or you're not that comfortable with, I think it's really important to actually have that conversation and be like, what am I willing to engage in? So, for example, heaps of people talk about how their partners might have a cuckolding fetish and they themselves don't want to sleep with anyone else, but there's many ways that they can push those boundaries without actually doing it, whether it be with toys, with role play, with chat roulette, like so many different ways.
Oh, good old chat roulette.
Yeah, gosh, which is basically just turned into
Yuck.
like
The amount of dicks. That way.
yeah. 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 You know how we talked about one day we would do like a live stream and have special guests on it? One day we should just do a live stream on chat roulette and,
Oh.
and see.
Just get the
We couldn't
weirdest
put it on
people there.
YouTube. We'd have to make a Patreon or something and put it on there. But
The
that
amount
would
of
be
sex
funny.
crimes I was part of, probably, because I was always, when you were under 18, you look on there and there's just a bunch of people jacking off.
Yeah. Yeah. I was on there all the time when I was like 10.
Yeah, same.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just, I saw a woman put her entire wine bottle up there,
Yeah.
which was
I bet.
fascinating. Me and my friends applauded her afterwards. But yeah, I've seen some shit on there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so, and you know what's the most disturbing about it is like it's much more common with younger people than it is with any other age. So all those people getting off knowing that they're more likely to either come across someone else
Yeah.
that's getting off that's also a 50-year-old man or a child. So yeah, that's a bit of tricky. I
Too
think
much.
on one of them
That's-
though, maybe Omegle, you can like go on like a strictly no
No
dicks.
dicks.
Basically, I don't know what
That
what
should
they
probably
say.
be the norm, but
Yeah.
you gotta click. Oh, I don't want to see any dicks
Yeah.
today. Okay.
Yeah. Me and my friends did that
Jesus
like
Christ.
a year ago. I had a sleepover with like 6 girls. We went on whichever one had that option. And there was still a couple that snuck in. But most of it was just fun. Although, yeah, it was still weird. It's just
Yeah.
it brings out it's a lot of fun. It's just be safe if you're listening to this and you decide to explore.
It's funny. Yeah, I guess it's funny. I don't, because it's digital and you sort of know
Yeah.
what you're getting into. It's almost, you could argue, well, look, if you're going to go on chat roulette, you have to expect to see that. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Be prepared.
but yeah, I want to talk about, say, how this is continually broadening the definition of what is considered, say, an alternative sexuality. So, when we talk about the LGBT community, people who have different sexual preferences, but that is a major facet of who they are, who they're attracted to. And now I suppose pride as a concept is being associated with things like cuckoldry, or, that will often be associated with the LGBTQ plus pride movement. And to me, they're just such different things, because one, it's like it is a very significant facet of your identity, what your sexual preference may be. I still would argue it doesn't need to be the main facet of said identity, but cuckoldry is a preference, a sort of a proclivity that you may engage in the privacy of your own home. And is it actually harming the cause of the LGBT, I guess the bulk of that LGBT community, which when all these different communities are constantly being added to it, and there's not really any kind of bureaucracy determining what is considered part of the LGBT plus community. It just seems as though any community that perceives itself as sort of outside of the norm, outside of the mainstream, can attach itself to that. And talking about what we were talking about earlier, for a lot of people who, it might have been a big step for them to accept
Yeah.
gay people, lesbian people, gay marriage, things like that. And, that's not necessarily to say that their opinion should always be validated either. But then when all these new things are constantly being added on, it just, it can be overkill for a lot of people. And then the core demographic of where that LGBT community came from actually suffer, because when you see all these other flags in different communities that are part of, Pride, you think, well, hang on, like what are, I don't even know what half of them are at this point. And it can sort of adversely impact just gay, lesbian, bisexual people.
Yeah, yeah. It has become. I'm in two minds about it. I don't want to say it's become overcomplicated because a lot of people like this. It is the most important thing of their life to say I'm a demisexual, bisexual, or pangender. Like they can have a million titles for themselves, and I don't want to invalidate that by saying it's overkill or it's too much.
And really quickly, I would even
Yeah.
say, yeah, because that's a sort of gender identity, which I'd still separate
Yeah.
from a sexual
Yeah.
a fetish.
Yeah, which is going to be my next point is that under the LGBTIQA umbrella, it's more about attraction to another person or lack of attraction, for example, asexual, whereas fetish and kink is about attraction to a body part or non-living object. So there is that differentiation, but however, that issue still is prevalent. I remember there was talk recently about there were literally people advocating to include pedophilia into the LGBTI community understanding because it was an attraction to a specific group of people. And then people were even going on branching off that about bestiality. But pedophilia and bestiality are paraphilias, which is basically means highly inappropriate sexual proclivity, which will hinder you or hinder the safety of others, and it's not not recommended.
And this
Basically,
hurts the cause of gay
yeah,
rights and gay acceptance
yeah,
when you add all these other
yeah.
communities to it.
And even though that was widely rejected and it didn't end up coming around, there may still be people that have pedophilic tendencies or bestiality tendencies and will go around saying or believing they're part of the LGBTI community because I'm a community of people that aren't attracted to heterosexual relationships. So there does become an issue with that, and I, in some ways, to play devil's advocate, obviously I'm in no support of pedophilia, but there is not a community where people can talk and seek support for that. It is a highly secretive, confidential, even often most people that have pedophilic tendencies or thoughts don't engage or speak to a therapist. So there is such limited support, and I do feel that more support is needed to those communities because for some people, for many, probably even most, that is an attraction that they don't want to have, and they may hate themselves from having, and they've never acted on it whatsoever. So when there's no community to talk about that with, and no one to acknowledge it or confess to without being absolutely shamed, then what further repercussions of that could there be? However, then the other issue is that when a community can be developed for that, you get child porn rings where people are just sending pornography to one another, and it's not really the community you should be engaging with.
You get AI, and now AI is being used to distribute a lot of that.
Yeah, deep fakes. Like AI can't really differentiate if they're putting a child's face on. It's just so sad. And I actually saw someone saying that when he was in, I can't remember what country it was. I know it was like near Argentina, but he was traveling somewhere very small and rural, and he said he went through a DVD shop and there was just categories and videos of child porn everywhere, and it was just like so normalized in that country. And
Whoa.
well, at least in
What?
that video shop, yeah, he said there was videos of
Argentina.
bestiality, there was videos of everything, and he said he looked on the back of the child porn thinking this surely isn't literal, and it literally had like horrific scarring traumatizing images, and yeah, so it is hard,
Yeah.
and that's, I mean, we're lucky to be in this country where it is so taboo, so illegal. There's so many things in place. Obviously, it still happens, but in other countries, it's like, I need to feed my family tonight, so I will sell my child or make a video online for a Westerner man who's going to pay me $5.
I
It's
mean,
just,
I don't care how poor you are. I could never
yeah,
excuse that.
of course, but that's just what happens. It's so, and there's so little support for it. Oh God, it makes me so sad when you like look into it. It's like sick. But anyway, this is getting
It's
into a
getting
whole
dark.
other
Yeah,
kettle of fish.
I do agree with you about people who have pedophilia
Yeah,
centered thoughts that don't act on it. I don't think then they should necessarily be judged as immoral. That is a
yeah,
psychological deficiency or just illness that they may have, and it should be treated as such. The second they
yeah,
act on it, criminal.
yeah,
Uh, Having said that, the aims for, at least from from a straight man, the aims of the LGBT plus community seem to be very different to that, which is, one is being treated as a pathology, whereas one is, the whole point is to say, no, this is not a pathology, this is normal. And you take something like, expressing LGBT characters in popular art or in, stories to children, right? If I'm sure most parents nowadays wouldn't really care if there's, say, actually it depends, because now there's all sorts of things happening in America. But if your kids are reading a book or something, and then the husband said to the other husband or whatever, and it's just in there, and there's not really any
yeah,
big fuss about it. Having said that, if you take this normalizing of everything to its end, seemingly its end goal, then in that same book, and then the husband, went home and engaged in his normal behavior of cuckoldry. Well, no, like I don't have kids, but if I was a parent, I wouldn't want kids being exposed to something like that. But I would have no problems whatsoever with a child being exposed to the two dads, Greg and Greg,
yeah,
or whatever
yeah,
it may be.
yeah, yeah,
And that's where I just can't help but feel it's hurting the LGBT
yeah,
community, all these sort of other communities constantly being attached to that. And
yes,
maybe they
yeah,
need a separate movement or something, because the aims
yeah.
seem very different.
Yeah, exactly. And that issue was coming up a lot as well when we were doing the vote for um, gay marriage to be legal in Australia. And so many more people saying, well, if we say yes to that, then we have to say yes to monogamy, and we have to say yes to polygamy and, sorry, not monogamy, polygamy, multiple marriages and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no, that actually isn't part of the LGBTI community. This is one battle of two people wanting to get married, and we're saying no because of potential doors that may open. And it's just that psychological reasoning, and people automatically linking LGBTI community with still thinking about it subconsciously as something that is obscure or outside of the norm and things like that. Like, it's really not out of the norm. I remember it must be, I don't know what the current stat is, but like 10 years ago, it was like 1 in 10 people. It must be more than that now that are engaged, that are part of the LGBTI community. I must look that up quickly. But
Yeah, I think it's now 1 in 5 or something like that
yeah,
in America. But that's also because it's being broadened to say with what you were talking about with. Now I don't know how many. I would guess the majority of the LGBT community wouldn't want pedophiles and
yeah,
people who are
yeah,
into bestiality as part of that broad group. But if people are seeing that online, and there are a select minority of people advocating for that, it validates the concerns of the conservatives when that gay marriage vote was going through, because then they can say, oh, see, look, now they're trying to normalize bestiality and pedophilia. So the deeper psychological issue seems to be that a lot of these, what would have historically been left wing and liberal, culturally liberal communities, they're not rules based. They're all about sort of being open and free and behaviorally liberal. And when there are no rules and no guidelines, it does keep the door slightly ajar for other communities to come in and say, oh, this is a place of acceptance. Hey, we're into fucking animals. Will you accept us? And then it's hard for a community that's known for accepting alternative sexualities to draw a line and say, no, you are getting shamed for wanting to fuck a tiger, and you probably should be shamed. Or you
Yeah.
should, maybe not shame, but go to a therapist and sort that out, or keep it in your fantasy world. And that, again, all of this from an outsider's perspective, it does seem to be something that the LGBT community is grappling with. There's these people I follow on social media who actually, their whole ethos is drawing a line after the T, or some will even say after the B. We need to be our own thing, lesbian, gay, and bisexual. And it's interesting, and it's also a bit sad because a lot of people are being hurt by this.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It is a tricky thing, and it's interesting that that group had to, and that community had to fight so hard to have a community that was accepted, and then it's consistently growing, which is, it's a good thing and could be a harmful thing at the same time. And then that's why I think in some ways people always complain about there's a million flags, there's a million different communities now, but I think it's good that there actually are, and that it's not all falling under one umbrella, and that people are reaching out and creating their own separate communities for something that's a little bit more specific to that one thing. So yeah, I guess like we said, you and I aren't the experts on this to talk about it, but there is a crossover, and there's a crossover of people thinking that fetish and kink fall under this. And it's like, just because LGBTI people also engage in fetish and kink doesn't mean that that umbrella of the community is to be accepting people just based on fetish and kink. It is purely for an attraction to this group or all groups of people. It's about like love and acceptance in that sense, or in the sense that if you're asexual, the opposite. But having that community of, we've faced so many adversities and we've fought so hard for our rights. And then I guess, like you said, then it comes down to more people and more groups and other communities saying, we want to fight for our rights too. We want to fight for our rights as something that may be less common. But I'm not seeing too much of it. Like, I wouldn't say it's definitely not dominating at the moment,
No,
but
that's true.
then again, someone might say different.
It's probably just, it doesn't need to necessarily be attached to that community.
Yeah.
That's all. I think, why
Yeah.
not just have your own kind of
Exactly. Yeah.
whatever you want? Because again, the aims seem to be different. One is
Yeah.
sort of just saying that this is a sexual preference and it's not an abnormality necessarily. Whereas a fetish, it's if you see two guys holding hands in public, it's not a big deal. Whereas
Yeah.
if you're seeing furries kind of walking around, it's also not as a bigger deal. But then if you see furries engaging in sexual behavior in public, well, that's very different. I mean, there are other societal concerns at play, and they're not really. The only thing they really have in common is that, okay, they're not the norm, but
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
again, like,
And
yep, I'm not. It's not my community, so.
moving on, I guess, from the LGBTI aspect, but still staying on like the theme of communities and groups. One thing I will say, because I'm such an advocate for join your community, find the group, is that it's really hard to monitor the safety that people might find these group that are, or even listeners to this might be teenagers, and then being like, oh, there's a group for everything, I'll go find my community. And that girl I talked about at the start that was into, she participated in the fairy community. I worked with her for 4 years. So she was 14 and in the furry community when she started. And no one in that community knew that she was a child in year 9, because she had the full fursuit. First of all, she didn't even look young, but secondly, she had the full fursuit. So she had the mask, I don't know what that's called, the headpiece, and she had the whole body suit, everything custom made. And she'd go to communities, and sometimes they will talk verbally, or other times it's waving and hugging and not using full voice. But anyway, she ended up having a boyfriend who was in his late 30s, and he had no idea how old she was. And she refused to give me his name because she was familiar with the system and knew I would have to, legally, I'd have to report it. But it was so controversial on both sides. And then she was talking about how, oh, this weekend I'm going to this convention. It's, a bunch of fairies meeting in Sydney. I'm bringing a friend. And I was like, is your friend also a child? Yes, it is. So then there's multiple children going, and they have a literal disguise on. So that becomes a whole other kettle of fish or even think about things like glory holes. You don't know who's you're engaging with there. There's so much risk, and you're protected under, I guess, the law if you literally don't know and you can prove you never knew their age. But what are the morals of that, and what are the safety and what are the
How do you catch that person,
concerns for the children? I know I worked with a client once, and she had a lot of trauma and a lot of problems, but she would do anything to get, for example, hair extensions. So she'd find a random man online, say, here's my address, come pick me up. You have me for 10 minutes, we'll do whatever, but you have to buy my hair extensions or buy me shoes. And she gave no shits about it. This girl had so much trauma. It was really sad. But I was like, are these men aware? She was 15. I said, are these men aware that you're a child? No idea. They just thought she was a sex worker. Or just not even just a sex worker, well, just doing sex work, being like, oh, I've randomly got a message from a girl saying, I'll do this if you do this, thinking it was a once-off thing. And she did it every single night. Get my nails done, I'm hungry. It was really sad. And she had a sad life, but there's so much there that when you're reaching out to find people to engage with, you do have to be conscious and you do have to be aware. Just like on Tinder, you always see people that are like 17 being like, well, I'm almost 18. I mean, I never saw that. Obviously, I wouldn't put my age down to 18 to see that occurring to other people all the time. Especially girls do that more frequently, being like, I'm almost an adult.
Yeah, and then they'll get into clubs. They could be 15, 16 with a fake ID at a club. They could easily look 23, 24. And then, that's it's entrapment, but then it's also an act of pedophilia. But if he didn't know and he reasonably thought she was over 18, then you can't really prosecute that. It's a pretty tough situation. But hey, how about we finish on a less depressing note? Well, that's pretty hard after I don't know how we just suddenly take a U-turn and talk about foot fetishes are funny. That's one where, it's actually pretty, like you say, it's quite normal. And it's sort of funny. If a partner said, hey, I'm into feet, I don't think it's that big a deal.
It's bad. If there's any fetish to have,
with that.
I feel like that is the most simple one to please. If your partner said, I'm into this, happy days. Don't have to do anything. Like,
what is surprisingly a common one? Okay, look, this is anecdotal, but a handful of when I say a handful, maybe 2 or 3 casual partners were into urination, like being urinated on.
Yeah, golden showers are so popular.
Yeah,
I feel like, you know what though? I feel like that was a very popular thing that's dying out. I don't see it as much anymore as I used to. So it's funny how
did you
things
see it
change.
a lot? Did you?
You wouldn't believe how many times someone has approached me to ask for that in my life randomly.
What, just in public?
No, like online, on Instagram or Tinder back in the day, like so many times. And I will say I never engaged in it. I'm just going to put that out there before rumors start. But it's so common. I feel like it's not as common anymore. And I even don't see it come across much on like Reddit. But what is growing is tentacle fetish. So there's a whole new lines of sex toys that look like tentacles. And I thought this would be more popular with men, but it's a woman thing, slightly more so. Yeah. So
He
that's
doesn't really have tentacles, does he? Was there a Disney character that we grew up with that had tentacles? I can't think of any, but I've always thought when white women, well, mostly white women, say they're into brown guys, I immediately assume, oh, you loved Aladdin as a kid. I just jump to that because
that's so
I never
funny.
liked The Little Mermaid, but my sister watched it every single day, and then I've always had a liking for redheads, and I just link it to that. But it could, I don't know,
That's
it could be something
so
else.
funny.
But
I love that.
I just assume, yeah, if a girl will, because there's actually quite a few now who will say, yeah, I like brown guys. There's curry fever or whatever they want to say,
Yeah.
and it's either that they could just like it, but being me, I gotta think of some deep psychological uh, reason for that proclivity, and it's either that they loved Aladdin as a kid, or that may have been the first very significant Disney film that they watched,
Yeah.
or they had a crush on Zayn when they were 13,
Yeah.
14.
It's so true. I just looked up tentacle porn and I got blocked from the website. I mean, I didn't look up tentacle porn. I looked up the subreddit on it, but I had to log in at CBF. Anyway, it says why people that are into it, why. And someone said that in Japan they banned penises from porn, so you can't see penises. They blur it. So that was their workaround, was to use tentacles. I don't know if that's true. Obviously, I just literally just read this a second ago. And then other people that were saying they were into it said it's something about, one person said, because I like weird and nasty shit, so I like it. And another person said the thought of being restrained and tickled in multiple parts of my body at the same time is what turns me on. So that's very interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
can see that. But what that guy said, I like weird and nasty shit. It comes back to what I was saying at the start of this podcast, which is I'm assuming many of these fetishes are so attractive and desirable because
Yeah.
they're inappropriate, because
Yeah.
they're outside of the norm and they're taboo and they're
Yeah.
naughty. And
Yeah.
I would suggest that it may be counterintuitive to constantly look to normalize all of these communities and fetishes, because then fewer people would be attracted to it.
Yeah.
All those statistics about casual sex or just number of sexual partners, which has drastically gone down in the West over time, despite the continued normalization of casual sex and casual partners and hookups and the technology to be able to facilitate that. My guess is that as soon as something becomes normal and loses its taboo, it loses its edge, it loses its exciting and titillating and naughty features, which is what makes it so attractive, particularly to people who might be more compelled to explore, dangerous
Yeah.
ideas or phenomena. And so don't necessarily need to normalize anything and everything, as long as there's still the right for you to do that in the privacy of your own home.
Yeah. Get weird with
Let's
it.
keep tentacle porn on the internet. Let's not. The next Netflix show, like, we're inclusive to the tentacle porn community, and our main character has tentacles.
True.
All right. Any final thoughts on this one?
Just that I hope that no one felt shamed during this podcast, and that anything goes as long as it's not harming yourself or others. I mean, well, you know what I mean. Maybe it is about that's like the whole BDSM thing, but you know what I mean. As long as everyone's consenting, there's no children or animals involved. Have fun. Be safe.
Yeah, agreed. All right. Thanks for listening, guys. Make sure you subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on TikTok, on Instagram, share the podcast, and come see a live show. Follow our personal accounts on Instagram, and we will see you next week.
See you next week.